guys hear me?
Yeah.
I don't know whether I can project well enough or not. If you can't, let me know and I'll come back and get the microphone.
It's not working anyway.
It work? This work?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I was lucky enough to be a member of this club in 1952 and then went to St. Louis in 1983 and was a member at large throughout that and then came back about a year ago. I can't tell you all what a privilege it is to be back here with you guys. All of you all have always been leaders of the community. You do a very, very worthwhile job in keeping this club going. Where else can you go at noon and stand up and give the Pledge of Allegiance and then have a very, very neat prayer? I mean, this is just a fine, fine organization of people. We're all blessed to be a member. In the turn of the century, Tony Blair was the Prime Minister of England. And he was asked a question about what makes a good nation or a good country, and how do you evaluate one? And he gave this very provocative reply. I'll tell you how you evaluate a nation. You measure it by the number of people who want to come in, by those who want to leave. My gosh, Lions, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people, they bust their button to get in here. How many of you all know somebody who's left because they don't like it? We measure up pretty well. And as Peter said a while ago, tomorrow is the 233rd anniversary of the signing of the Constitution, Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Now, members of the Lions Club, why does everybody want to come in to this country? We can look at all our resources. Everybody here has all they could say grace over. Everybody always wants more, of course. And there are underprivileged, of course. But my heavens, it's for one reason that they come in here. It's this little 15-page document, the Constitution of our country. That's why they come. We ought to be celebrating that annually. And Bart, we ought to have somebody speak on the Constitution every year, just to refresh our memories. Lions Club, if you give me a few moments, let's take a few minutes to have Constitution 101 as a refresher. This is nothing new, but we need to remind ourselves of it. You remember in 1775 when the war began and went into 76 when the Declaration of Independence was signed, written by Thomas Jefferson. And we were fighting a battle to be eliminated from a country that we felt was taking advantage of us. And we fought for 6 years. The war wasn't over until 1781. 6 years. And in all fairness, those wonderful people, we don't derogate their responsibilities and their character and courage, but the reason we won that war was because of our geographic isolation and because Great Britain and France were fighting each other in Europe. And so after the war was over, Cornwallis surrendered in Norfolk, 1781, we were adrift. The only way you could get around was on horseback. And the roads were lousy. If you had a buggy and a wagon, fine. We had a loose organization under what's called the Articles of Confederation, in which it was a semblance of the form of government among the 13 colonies. And when they would meet in Philadelphia, the people up in Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, and Vermont, it'd take them 4 or 5 days to get there, and then to come back home. We didn't have any currency, gold or silver pieces, if you had some, a little pound sterling occasionally, but it was all by barter. You traded a hog for a little flour and salt. We didn't have any army or navy or anything to protect us. We had no finances of any kind, no postal service, and we were really adrift. Each one of the little colonies was trying to hold its own with its own little legislature. And finally, some of the heads got together later in the spring, the late spring of 1787. And they said, this has got to stop. We've got to form some kind of government. And so they agreed to meet, and everybody sent delegates from the colonies to Philadelphia to meet. And there are about 55 of them, and they'd come in off and on. Some would come in and stay a few weeks and then go back home and then come back again. The ones that were close by generally came all of the time. But they weathered the storm all summer, and nobody could agree. They didn't want a president or a dictator. They didn't want another King George. They didn't want somebody that could tax you. They didn't want anything in authority. And yet they realized if we're going to have a government, we have to have some kind of authority. And there has to be some give and take. And so near the end of August, they finally arrived at a great compromise that we'll go into in just a moment. After that Constitution was written, then it was signed by 39 delegates who were all that were there at the time. Tomorrow, 233 years ago. And then everybody went home. And the job then was the Constitution as drafted had to be ratified by 9 states at least out of the 13. And each one of them went to their own legislatures or town hall meetings in an attempt to determine whether the state would ratify this Constitution. Patrick Henry, the great guy from Richmond, Virginia, who argued against revolution, didn't support the Constitution. Too much power in these various branches of government. I'm against it. We need to be left alone. And this kind of debate went all through each one of the colonies. A little bit before Christmas, in 1787, New Jersey became the first one. I need my teleprompter. It's either New Jersey or Delaware. I believe it was Delaware. I misspoke. Delaware was the first one to ratify. The other states kept at it. And then finally in June of 1788, it's not Vermont, it was in Rhode Island, New Hampshire. New Hampshire ratified the Constitution, and that was the 9th state. So it became our Constitution then, in June 1788. Now, who were the 4 state holdouts? Really interesting. Rhode Island was one, North Carolina was one, Virginia, and New York, the holdouts. And the big states then by population were generally New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia, almost Massachusetts. But with the exception of Pennsylvania, the medium and little states won. And they're the ones mainly that were responsible for getting this Constitution for us. Without going into the niceties of it, Washington was persuaded to become the president. They had the first meeting of a Congress. The electors selected him and he became the first president, and the nation was off to the races, 1789. Now, Lance, your Constitution 101 again. Very important. You know these things, but let's rehash them. This compromise was unparalleled in history. Never before had any country had this kind of a government. The government was in 3 parts: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Now, the legislative branch, too, was historical. The Brits had the House of Lords and the House of Commons, but nothing like this. They still had a king. We had this bicameral legislative form of government. You know it, the Senate and the House. To be a senator, you had to be 30 years old, and you were elected by popular vote, as you know. And the one with the most votes became the senator for a 6-year term. Great debate over how long that should be, but a 6-year term. Then we had the House of Representatives. But before I get to the House, remember the important part of the Senate. Every state has 2 senators. You can have 1 million population or 100,000 population. You still get 2 senators. Now the House is the other branch of this bicameral form of government. To be a member of the House, you've got to be 25 years old, and you're elected by popular vote for 2 years. But the House is selected by population. So the states with the larger population have the greater number of legislators. This was all done at the time for Rhode Island, a little bitty old place. Really, Rhode Island is just a little bit bigger than southeast Missouri. And it had a small population. But Rhode Island, during the framing of the Constitution, said, hey, we need to be represented, whatever our population is. So they were, with 2 senators. But they only had 1 member of the House. And the more populous states had a greater number of members of the House. I'll get into the electorate in just a moment. But that's the way these 2 bodies were fashioned. All elected by popular vote for a particular term. Every state is equal in representation in the Senate, but not in the House. Now the powers of Congress, as you know, they are enormous. Congress passes the laws. And in order for it to be a law, both the Senate and the House must agree to the law. And then it goes to the president for the president's signature. Congress can tax us, as we know, and they do. And this was one of the concerns. This body's given the power to determine how much tax we pay. They can declare war. Congress can declare war. They have enormous powers of all kinds. Then we come to the executive branch, the president. Nobody knows what to call him. Washington had feelers out for Washington, hoping he would agree to become the president. And so they came to the word president. Another interesting thing about it, why they wanted Washington. He had no heirs. So there'd be no line of succession like there is in so many of the European and other countries. Besides, he was the most reverend guy in the area, the whole 13 colonies. Now, the president has to be 35 years of age, and the wording is interesting. We think of native-born citizen. It's called natural-born citizen, and that's led to controversy. What does that mean? A natural-born citizen. But that's been brought up in our history as one of the qualifications that you have to meet. Now, how is the president selected? The president is selected by electoral vote. Each state has so many electors. And here's the way you determine the electors. You total the number of senators that each state has equally, and add to that the number of members of the House that state has. For illustration, Missouri has 10 electors. We have 2 senators and 8 members of the House of Representatives. Listen to this. Do you believe this? New York has 55. Did you know that New York had 53 members of the House? 53 members. Texas is next. Texas has 46 electors. So 43 or 44 members of the House. New York and Florida are next. They each have 29. So they have 27 members of the House. Now that was done also as part of a so-called compromise, so that everybody could participate through this process rather than in a popular vote where 2 or 3 or 4 states could actually control the country, although they may anyway. But we have had problems as to how to cast these electoral votes. Historically, each state's electors have voted for the person receiving the highest number of popular vote in that state. And most of the time, that's been the case. But there's been some deviation occasionally. There's nothing in the Constitution that says an elector must vote for whoever. But ordinarily it has been for the popular vote, the one receiving the popular vote. Now, about 15 to 18 states have passed laws that mandate that electors from that state must vote as an elector for president for the person who has the biggest popular vote in that state. The Supreme Court came down with a decision in July that said that's okay. It passes constitutional muster. But that's only 15 or 18. So the rest of us can do as we please, and we'll see what happens in a couple of months. Very interested to see how the electors are going to vote for president. Now, the president has enormous powers also. The president can veto a law of Congress. The president is the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy and the state militia. That's a National Guard. As we know, the president can call out the National Guard in times of emergency. The president can appoint his cabinet. He can appoint ambassadors. He appoints the judges to the federal courts. He has all kinds of powers of appointment and the right to make treaties. Generally, this is done with the advice and the consent of the Senate. Now, the next branch of government is the Supreme Court. This is strange, and it's been under attack frequently, and I can understand why. Judges for the federal courts, well, first of all, the Constitution says that there shall be a Supreme Court of the United States, and all inferior courts that Congress may determine is appropriate. So as we have progressed as a nation, Congress has declared intermediate courts to the Supreme Court and district courts where the trial commences, just like Judge Lewis's cases. But in addition to being a lifetime appointment, there is no qualification in the Constitution. You don't have to be a lawyer to be a member of the United States Supreme Court. Really unusual that they did not get into that. I think they did and couldn't agree, like we frequently are have problems today. But the innuendo, it's not a specific designation in the Constitution, but the innuendo is that the Supreme Court has the right to declare a law unconstitutional, and it doesn't meet all of the requirements of the Constitution. Now, the Supreme Court, in the case of Marbury versus Madison, pulled up their own bootstraps and said, that's right, we have the right to declare a law unconstitutional. It's been challenged, but not successfully. So we can assume that the Supreme Court can declare any law unconstitutional. It doesn't pass constitutional muster, and therefore it's not a law. If it's been enacted, it's invalid. That's enormous, enormous power, especially with somebody who's there till they die. Okay, here we have this unparalleled, different form of government. Each branch with enormous power. Here's how it's worked so far. You've heard the term checks and balances. The best illustration is Congress passes a law. That is, both the House and the Senate have agreed to it. It goes up to the president's desk, and the president refuses to sign it. So it's not a law. Congress has the right, under the Constitution, to override the president's veto of the law. Only if 2/3 of the members of both the Senate and the House concur. So the Congress can pass the law, the president vetoes it, Congress can override the veto, it becomes a law. Big checks on each other. But that's not the last check. 2 or 3 years down the road, somebody files a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of that law. And it ultimately gets up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, no, it doesn't pass constitutional muster. So the law's invalidated. There's the other check. There are many, many other illustration, members of the club, that shows how each one of these parts of government can keep the other part from getting too big. Now, all of us have our own points of view about who's too big. As far as I'm concerned, they all are too big. But that's Patrick Henry's argument. We have to have government, and we have to have somebody that can levy taxes, build our roads, keep us going, protect us, if it can be protected today. But we have to have a form of government. Now, again, this is not a panacea, this Constitution, but it's been working reasonably well for 233 years. And I, for one, am here to endorse it. You know, you've read this and you've learned it on your own. When Dr. Franklin walked out of the hall, Independence Hall, after signing his name to the Constitution, someone asked him, "What do we have, Dr. Franklin?" And he responded, "We have a republic if we can keep it." Lions, I'm sure in your experience too, I've never seen such a vitriolic attack on these 15 pages in this document as exists today. It reminds me of the feeling that Longfellow had when he wrote the poem, The Building of the Ship. And at the end, he said, "Thou too sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its hopes, with all its fears, with all the hope for future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate." Members of the Lions Club, the ship of state will sail on. It must, because of this. Y'all are very accommodating. Thank you.